The Sherman tank and its first encounter with Japanese defenses when the first rumble of American tanks began to reverberate through the Pacific Islands. It was met with skepticism and contempt by the Japanese forces. To the Imperial Army, the M4 Sherman was little more than a rolling target, easily destroyed by their entrenched anti-tank guns and field artillery. In fact, many referred to it derisively as a Ronson Lighter, a cruel joke inspired by the tank's vulnerable engine compartment. Lights up every time, they'd laugh, dismissing the threat posed by these cumbersome, slow-moving machines. But what the Japanese did not anticipate was how these lighters would soon become the very thing that would threaten to burn their defenses to the ground. Their ignorance of the Sherman's true power would soon be exposed, not by a single tank, but by a battle-hardened platoon that would use this underestimated machine to level some of the most formidable fortifications the Japanese had ever constructed. The year was 1943, and the United States military was locked in a brutal struggle to reclaim the Pacific from Japanese control. While naval forces dominated much of the fighting, the ground forces, led by the United States Marine Corps and Army, began their relentless island-hopping campaign. They faced fierce resistance in the form of deeply entrenched Japanese pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery positions, formidable obstacles that had been meticulously designed to hold off any land invasion. Yet, as the fighting in the Pacific intensified, so too did the necessity for new, innovative tactics. The Sherman's design, which had been widely criticized by some for its lack of speed and firepower compared to German tanks, found an unexpected strength in the unforgiving conditions of the Pacific theater. Though it may have seemed out of place on the Pacific Islands, too bulky, too prone to mechanical failure, the Sherman's reliability, ease of maintenance, and its simple but effective armament soon proved invaluable. But it would take a hard lesson before its critics learned just how powerful it could be. The breakthrough moment came during the assault on one of the most heavily fortified islands in the Pacific, Tarawa. The Japanese, entrenched in their well-defended positions, scoffed at the Sherman tanks, sure of their ability to destroy them before they could do any significant damage. But it wasn't until a platoon of Shermans hit the battlefield, rolling forward in support of infantry, that they realized just how wrong they were. The Battle of Tarawa, the Sherman's first true test. The assault on Tarawa, in the Gilbert Islands, had all the makings of an incredibly difficult and bloody fight. It was November 1943, and the United States was looking to make a decisive push deeper into the Pacific. The Japanese were well entrenched in a labyrinth of pillboxes, bunkers, and anti-tank obstacles. The island was relatively small, but its defenders had turned it into a fortress, relying on the natural terrain and an intricate network of fortified positions to hold off any invader. At first glance, the Sherman tank seemed poorly suited for the challenge. Its relatively light armor was a far cry from the heavily armored German tanks the Allies had faced in North Africa and Europe. On paper, the Sherman's 75mm gun seemed underwhelming compared to the larger cannons of enemy tanks. Its open turret design was also vulnerable to enemy fire, and the tank's engine, prone to overheating and catching fire, made it seem like an easy target for Japanese gunners. In fact, the Japanese mockingly referred to the M4 Sherman as the Ronson Lighter, suggesting that it would ignite as easily as a cigarette lighter when hit. Yet, in the face of intense fire, the Sherman would prove its critics wrong. The landing force at Tarawa, consisting of Marines and Army troops, was tasked with clearing the Japanese defenses and making their way toward the island's airfield. As the assault began, the Marines quickly realized the full extent of the Japanese fortifications. The pillboxes, made of reinforced concrete, were designed to withstand artillery fire and bombing runs, making them nearly impervious to direct attacks from infantry. The Marines found themselves pinned down, unable to advance under the relentless fire from these well-positioned strongpoints. In response, the U.S. Army decided to deploy the M4 Sherman tanks to support the assault. Though many had doubted the tank's effectiveness in the jungle conditions of the Pacific, the Shermans were brought forward to clear obstacles and provide direct fire support for the infantry. As the tanks moved inland, their engines roared over the coral beaches, seemingly undeterred by the incoming Japanese artillery fire. Yet, it wasn't the tank's firepower that would change the course of the battle, but rather its ability to deliver continuous, overwhelming support to the infantry in ways the Japanese hadn't expected. As the tanks advanced, they fired on Japanese pillboxes with their 75mm guns, but the heavily fortified structures only shrugged off the shells, which often bounced harmlessly off the concrete. The Marines, relying on these tanks for cover, began to question whether the Shermans would be able to make a dent in the defenses. But the Sherman's true advantage wasn't in its firepower. It was in its adaptability. As the battle progressed, a Marine platoon led by Lieutenant Colonel David Shoup began using the Shermans in a new, unexpected role: direct demolition. The tanks, instead of relying solely on their guns, began to use their heavy tracks to crush obstacles, flattening barbed wire and collapsing concrete structures under their weight. They didn't just fire shells. They became the battering rams of the battlefield, rolling over pillboxes and reducing them to rubble. The tanks, which had been underestimated by the Japanese, became the spearheads of a new type of assault, one that used brute force to displace the very terrain that had once been an impenetrable defense. The effectiveness of this new tactic became clear when a platoon of Sherman tanks led an assault against a particularly stubborn pillbox complex. The Japanese defenders, confident in their entrenched position, fired at the approaching tanks with everything they had: anti-tank guns, mortars, even hand grenades. But despite the heavy fire, the Sherman tanks pressed forward, their tracks grinding over sand and rock, crushing through wire obstacles, and slowly but surely flattening the pillboxes with each pass. The Japanese gunners soon found themselves trapped in their own fortifications, unable to escape or adjust their positions. The Sherman's firepower, combined with the ingenuity of the tank crews, turned the tide of the battle in favor of the Allies. What the Japanese had dismissed as a light and ineffective vehicle had turned into a relentless instrument of destruction. The tanks did not just break through enemy lines. They destroyed the very infrastructure that had been thought impervious to conventional assault. The Sherman tank, once mocked as a Ronson Lighter, had become a symbol of American ingenuity and resolve. The Battle of Tarawa would go on to be a grueling and costly victory for the United States, but the Sherman's performance proved crucial in securing the island. What had started as skepticism toward the Sherman's capabilities soon transformed into an admiration for its versatility in combat. The tank's ability to break the Japanese defenses in ways no other weapon could made it an invaluable asset in the Pacific theater. The Sherman tank's growing role in Pacific warfare as the Battle of Tarawa drew to a close, the success of the Sherman tanks was undeniable. The Allied forces had faced one of the most challenging fortifications in the Pacific, yet the Shermans had proven themselves capable of doing what was once thought impossible: taking on some of the most formidable defenses and turning them into rubble. What the Japanese once viewed as a mere Ronson Lighter had revealed its true worth as a powerful and adaptable weapon on the battlefield. The skepticism surrounding the M4 Sherman began to fade as the tank's true potential was realized not just on Tarawa, but in subsequent battles across the Pacific. What had once been considered a subpar vehicle for tank warfare was now seen as a crucial tool in the evolving tactics of the Pacific island hopping campaign. The American forces had learned to use their Sherman tanks not just as brute force artillery platforms, but as essential mobile fortresses that could help punch through the toughest defenses. By the time the Allies moved on to the Battle of Saipan in June 1944, the M4 Sherman had become a regular part of the U.S. Marine Corps and Army's assault plans. Saipan was another heavily fortified island, strategically positioned to give the Japanese the ability to launch attacks on Allied supply lines. The Japanese military had transformed the island into a nearly impregnable fortress, with a complex network of pillboxes, bunkers, and tunnel systems designed to withstand both bombing raids and ground assaults. Once again, the U.S. forces were met with formidable opposition. The terrain of Saipan, steep, rocky, and covered in thick jungle, was not ideal for tank maneuvers. But the same Shermans that had triumphed on Tarawa found themselves deployed in a variety of roles, from providing infantry support to acting as mobile artillery platforms. By now, the strategy was well established. Sherman tanks would lead the charge, clear obstacles, and support infantry with direct fire, especially when facing entrenched positions that would otherwise be nearly impossible to overcome. In Saipan, the U.S. Army and Marines deployed a new, improved version of the Sherman, the M4A3E2, also known as the Jumbo Sherman. This variant featured additional armor to better withstand the increased threat from Japanese anti-tank guns and other heavy artillery. It was clear that the Allies were not just responding to the battlefield, but actively learning and adapting to the ever-evolving nature of combat in the Pacific. With this new variant, the Sherman tank was transformed from a relatively vulnerable force into a heavily fortified, mobile assault platform, able to endure longer firefights and take on even more resilient Japanese positions. The effect on the Japanese forces, however, was nothing short of devastating. As the Sherman tanks rolled forward during the battle, the Japanese troops, who had initially dismissed them as vulnerable and ineffective, found themselves unable to respond effectively. The M4's armor, though not impenetrable, was more than sufficient to absorb the impact of most Japanese anti-tank weapons, allowing the tanks to advance steadily, even under heavy fire. The Japanese gunners, familiar with targeting thinner-skinned tanks, were unable to effectively engage the Sherman, which quickly became a terrifying force on the battlefield. During the battle, a platoon of Shermans led by Captain Edward R. Cummings spearheaded the assault on a well-defended Japanese stronghold. The complex, with its entrenched pillboxes and artillery positions, seemed impervious to direct fire. The Japanese gunners unleashed a barrage of shells, hoping to strike at the tanks. Yet, despite the pounding, the Shermans kept coming, their tracks grinding over the uneven terrain as they pushed forward relentlessly. Captain Cummings' platoon used their tank's sheer size and weight to their advantage. Rather than attempt to engage directly with the Japanese defenses, the Shermans simply moved forward, using their firepower to suppress the enemy and clear the way for infantry to advance. In one pivotal moment, Cummings' platoon directed a full tank assault on a series of pillboxes, surrounding the positions and using their 75mm guns to bombard the Japanese positions from multiple angles. The result was devastating. The pillboxes were destroyed or rendered useless, and the Japanese defenders were forced to retreat. Once again, the Sherman had proven itself not only a reliable, but also an invaluable tool in the Pacific campaign. No longer viewed with contempt, it had become a central pillar of the American war effort in the Pacific. The Japanese, who had initially mocked the Sherman's design and capabilities, now had to contend with the reality that these tanks were more than capable of overcoming their most formidable defenses as the Allies advanced further into the Mariana Islands and beyond. The role of the Sherman tank expanded. It was no longer just a support vehicle for infantry. It was a key element in breaking through the Japanese defenses, softening up enemy positions, and clearing the way for infantry and artillery to make their final push. The tank's success in Saipan, coupled with its triumphs in other battles like Iwo Jima and Okinawa, marked the beginning of a broader shift in the perception of the Sherman across the Pacific theater that in hindsight, the Ronson Lighter moniker was not just a misjudgment of the Sherman's capabilities. It was a reflection of the arrogance and overconfidence that characterized much of the Japanese military's mindset in the early days of the war. They had underestimated the ingenuity of the Americans, who had taken a seemingly underpowered tank and turned it into a tool of unmatched versatility. The lesson was clear: never underestimate an opponent who has the ability to adapt and innovate, especially when that opponent is armed with the will to succeed. For the Japanese, the Sherman was no longer a joke. It was a weapon that had flattened their defenses and changed the face of warfare in the Pacific. The impact of the Sherman tank on Japanese morale and strategy as the war progressed, the continued success of the Sherman tank on Pacific Islands began to have a profound effect on the Japanese military strategy and morale. What had once been viewed as a minor nuisance, a slow, underpowered vehicle with little chance against the Japanese army's entrenched positions, had now become an undeniable force of destruction. As the Americans pushed forward through island after island, the Sherman tanks became synonymous with the relentless advance of Allied forces, turning once impenetrable fortifications into rubble. By 1944, the sheer number of Sherman tanks deployed in the Pacific theater had reached staggering levels. They were no longer just part of the heavy assault forces. They were now integral to every aspect of the American strategy. On islands like Peleliu, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, the tanks worked in concert with infantry and artillery to break through defensive lines and clear the way for a full-scale invasion. Japanese forces, who had become accustomed to holding positions with entrenched machine guns and artillery, suddenly found themselves facing a new type of warfare. The Shermans were no longer just a threat to fortifications. They were beginning to exploit the very weakness in Japanese defensive strategy that had once been their strength. The traditional Japanese doctrine, heavily influenced by samurai culture, was rooted in individual valor and the belief that skill and bravery could overcome technological disadvantage. This mindset had worked in the early stages of the Pacific War when the Japanese had enjoyed technological superiority in many areas. However, as the U.S. began deploying new technologies like the Sherman, the Japanese military was forced to confront the fact that their traditional tactics were becoming obsolete. The U.S. military's strategic use of the Sherman tank reflected a shift toward a more industrialized, systematic approach to warfare, one that the Japanese simply couldn't match. The Americans had designed not just a tank, but a platform for sustained, coordinated attacks that relied on the strength of the system rather than the individual bravery of their soldiers. The Japanese, by contrast, still relied heavily on traditional individual combat techniques, which put them at a severe disadvantage when facing the massed industrial might of the United States. In response, the Japanese began to adapt their tactics, though not always successfully. They attempted to develop new anti-tank weapons and strategies designed to deal with the Sherman, but the sheer number of Allied tanks and their increasing resilience proved overwhelming. Japanese forces scrambled to modify their existing weapons, sometimes with little more than improvised solutions, such as attaching explosive charges to their artillery or using roadside bombs. However, these efforts were too little, too late. The Sherman tank, with its thickened armor and highly effective 75mm cannon, could take a beating and still continue its advance, a stark contrast to the more fragile Japanese vehicles and makeshift defenses. The psychological impact on the Japanese defenders was immense. As American forces continued their march through the Pacific, the presence of the Sherman tanks became a harbinger of doom. For the Japanese soldiers entrenched on these islands, facing the tanks was more than just a physical challenge. It was a mental one. The tank's seemingly indestructible nature created an atmosphere of fear and hopelessness among the defenders. Stories spread of Japanese soldiers hearing the unmistakable rumble of the tanks before they even saw them, and knowing that their pillboxes, bunkers, and artillery positions would soon be pulverized. The tanks became symbols of an unstoppable American advance, and the Japanese defenders began to realize that they were fighting against an enemy that could adapt, innovate, and overwhelm them. The defensive strategies they had relied on for years were no longer effective in the face of these powerful new machines. The presence of Shermans on the battlefield often led to a collapse in morale, with many Japanese soldiers surrendering or retreating rather than face the brutal power of the tanks. But the tanks' influence wasn't just psychological, it was tactical as well. The Sherman's firepower and armor allowed the Allies to adopt new strategies that maximized their ability to break through Japanese defenses. The tanks could engage from a distance, destroying bunkers and machine gun positions before infantry even set foot on the battlefield. This meant that the defenders were already weakened before the ground troops even arrived, making it easier for the Americans to sweep through the island and achieve victory. One of the clearest examples of the Sherman's tactical importance came during the Battle of Iwo Jima in February 1945. As American forces landed on the island, they faced some of the most difficult terrain and entrenched defenses they had encountered in the entire Pacific campaign. The Japanese had constructed a vast network of tunnels and fortified positions, making it nearly impossible for conventional infantry to make headway. The solution came in the form of Sherman tanks, which provided crucial support in neutralizing Japanese defenses. The tanks were outfitted with flamethrowers, and their ability to destroy entrenched positions with sustained fire became a key factor in the American victory. The tanks rolled across the volcanic ash of the island, their flamethrowers and 75mm guns scouring out the enemy positions one by one. The psychological effect of seeing a Sherman tank moving toward their pillbox, followed by a burst of flame or a powerful shell, was overwhelming for the Japanese defenders. Many would surrender rather than face the wrath of these machines. The Sherman tank was not only a tool of destruction, it was a symbol of the American determination to win at any cost. But the psychological impact didn't just affect the Japanese on the ground. The very sight of Shermans on the battlefield forced Japanese command to reevaluate their strategy. No longer could they rely solely on traditional defense methods. No longer could they count on infantry to hold the line in the face of overwhelming American technological superiority. The Sherman had proven that the U.S. military could bring industrial might to bear on any battlefield, leaving the Japanese with no viable counter. The evolution of Sherman tank tactics, refinement, and adaptation as the war in the Pacific progressed and the Americans advanced closer to Japan, the role of the Sherman tank evolved significantly. The early days of the island-hopping campaign, with tanks like the M4 proving themselves on islands such as Tarawa and Saipan, had given the U.S. military valuable experience in tank warfare in the Pacific's unique conditions. However, it wasn't until later battles, such as Iwo Jima and Okinawa, that the full tactical potential of the Sherman tank was realized, and its role in the success of the Pacific campaign was cemented. One of the key factors in the Sherman tank's success was its flexibility. Unlike many other tanks of the time, the M4 was a relatively simple and adaptable machine. Engineers and tank commanders quickly realized that by modifying the Sherman with specialized equipment, they could turn it into a multifaceted tool capable of handling various combat situations. These modifications were often born out of necessity and the lessons learned from previous battles. For example, in the dense, rugged jungles of the Pacific Islands, where visibility was often limited and the ground was unforgiving, the Sherman was given dozer blades. These large, heavy blades were attached to the front of the tank and allowed it to clear paths through the jungle, demolishing obstacles, uprooting trees, and even flattening the earth to create more navigable terrain for infantry. This modification allowed the tanks to help break through the dense vegetation and provide support to the soldiers who followed behind, transforming the Sherman from a simple armored vehicle into a vital tool for shaping the battlefield. In addition to the dozer blades, another modification that became crucial in later battles was the addition of flamethrowers. On islands like Iwo Jima, where the Japanese soldiers had built an extensive network of underground tunnels and fortifications, the ability to flush out enemy soldiers with fire became a critical tactic. The Ronson nickname, once a mocking reference to the Sherman's supposed vulnerability, began to take on a new meaning in this context. Tanks fitted with flamethrowers, often referred to as Zippos by the Marines, would advance into heavily fortified areas and unleash a stream of fire, incinerating entrenched Japanese soldiers who were hiding in bunkers or tunnels. These flamethrower tanks became a terrifying and effective tool for breaking the Japanese hold on the islands, and they were particularly useful in the fierce battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The experience of Iwo Jima, in particular, was a turning point in how the Sherman tank was used. The island's terrain, covered in volcanic ash and riddled with caves and fortifications, presented an entirely new challenge for the Americans. Tanks, which had often been used to clear enemy positions from a distance with their 75mm cannons, now had to fight in close quarters and navigate through rugged, uneven terrain. The addition of the flamethrower tanks, along with their more traditional tank variants, allowed the Americans to press their advantage. The tanks were able to destroy the Japanese fortifications, provide fire support for infantry, and advance into areas where infantry could not go without heavy losses. On Okinawa, the last major battle in the Pacific before the final push toward Japan's home islands, the Sherman tanks played a key role in breaking the Japanese defense and helping to secure the island. With over 100,000 Japanese soldiers dug into bunkers, caves, and heavily fortified pillboxes, American forces faced an intense battle. As the Marines and Army troops fought their way through the island, the Sherman tanks once again proved invaluable. They acted as mobile pillboxes themselves, their armor deflecting enemy fire, while their guns and flamethrowers methodically destroyed entrenched positions. The tactics developed on Okinawa were the culmination of everything learned in earlier battles. The tanks provided constant suppression fire, clearing out Japanese positions before the infantry could advance. As Japanese troops retreated into tunnels and caves, the tanks would follow up with flamethrowers, ensuring that the enemy had nowhere to hide. The tanks also played a key role in the protection of the American forces, especially during the close-quarter fighting in the island's narrow streets. Their firepower and sheer presence allowed the Americans to maintain momentum and prevent the Japanese from regrouping and mounting counterattacks. The sheer adaptability of the Sherman tank and the willingness of American engineers and commanders to modify it for different combat scenarios made it one of the most versatile machines in the U.S. arsenal. Whether it was clearing terrain, providing fire support, or using flame to flush out entrenched soldiers, the Sherman evolved from a simple weapon to a multi-purpose battlefield tool that could meet any challenge posed by the Japanese defenses at the same time. The Sherman's successes in the Pacific were not just about the tank itself. They were also about the men who operated it. The crews of the Sherman tanks had to be versatile and resourceful, able to adapt to the unique demands of combat in the Pacific theater. Tank crews quickly learned how to handle the Sherman's weaknesses, such as their relatively thin armor, while maximizing their strengths. They had to think on their feet, quickly adjusting to changing battlefield conditions, and often had to improvise solutions to problems on the fly. One of the most memorable stories of the Sherman tank's adaptability came from the Battle of Okinawa. A tank crew, after sustaining heavy fire from Japanese anti-tank guns, managed to make an emergency repair in the field using only what they had at hand: tools, scrap metal, and ingenuity. Despite the damage, the tank was able to continue fighting, and the crew's ability to adapt and push forward became a symbol of the Sherman's role in the war. It wasn't just the tanks that made a difference. It was the crews who used them, bringing their resourcefulness, courage, and tenacity to bear on every battle. By the time the final offensive against Japan began to take shape in mid-1945, the Sherman tank had become synonymous with the Allied victory in the Pacific. The tank's success was not merely the result of its engineering, but also its ability to serve in a variety of roles, support infantry, and adapt to ever-changing battlefield conditions. It was a symbol of American technological ingenuity and military doctrine, a force multiplier that helped turn the tide in the Pacific War. The legacy of the Sherman tank, a lasting impact on warfare. As the Pacific War drew to a close with the fall of Okinawa in mid-1945, the role of the Sherman tank in the American victory became undeniable. What had begun as a seemingly underwhelming tank, dismissed by both American commanders and the Japanese as unsuitable for the Pacific theater, had evolved into one of the most versatile and effective weapons of the war. The Sherman's triumphs in battles such as Tarawa, Saipan, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa had reshaped the very nature of combat in the Pacific, proving that innovation and adaptability could overcome the limitations of a weapon system. But beyond its success in the Pacific, the legacy of the Sherman tank extends far beyond its use in World War II. The lessons learned from its deployment in the Pacific reshaped military strategy and tank warfare for generations to come. In particular, the Sherman demonstrated the importance of versatility, adaptability, and mass production in modern warfare, lessons that would have far-reaching consequences for both the U.S. and the rest of the world in the years following the war. One of the Sherman's key innovations was its adaptability. In a time when many armies favored specialized tanks, heavily armored behemoths like the German Tiger or the Soviet T-34, America's decision to focus on a versatile, multi-role tank proved to be the key to its success. The Sherman's ability to take on different forms, from the basic M4 to the flame-throwing Zippos or the armored Jumbos, showed that a single tank model could be adapted to meet the demands of a wide variety of combat situations. This adaptability allowed the United States to deploy tanks in multiple theaters against multiple enemies with great success. It also allowed the military to adjust and refine the Sherman as the war progressed, learning from each battle and making incremental improvements. But perhaps the most profound legacy of the Sherman tank was its role in the mass production effort that helped secure the Allied victory. By the end of the war, over 49,000 Sherman tanks had been produced, more than any other tank in World War II. The sheer scale of its production was staggering, and the tank became a symbol of American industrial might. It was not just the quality of the Sherman that made it so important. It was the fact that it could be produced quickly and in vast numbers. As the war dragged on, the Allies' ability to produce tanks and other weaponry at an industrial scale gave them a crucial edge over the Axis powers, who simply could not match the speed and volume of production. The Sherman tank's success in the Pacific, however, also had important implications for future conflicts. The tank proved that a well-armored, mobile vehicle with versatile capabilities could become an indispensable part of modern warfare, even in the face of highly entrenched defenses and formidable opposition. While it was far from perfect, the Sherman's reliability, ease of maintenance, and ability to be adapted to new tactics made it an enduring example of the importance of practical, efficient design. The U.S. Army's experience in the Pacific would shape the development of future armored vehicles, influencing the design and strategy of tank warfare for decades to come. The U.S. military's embrace of the Sherman tank's adaptability and mass production would also shape Cold War military doctrine. In the years following World War II, the United States would continue to focus on building versatile, reliable vehicles that could be deployed in a variety of roles. The lessons learned from the Sherman's deployment in the Pacific would influence the development of future tanks, such as the M60 and the M1 Abrams, which would dominate tank warfare during the Cold War and into the 21st century. But the Sherman tank's legacy is not just technical. It also stands as a testament to the resilience and determination of the soldiers who operated it. The crews who fought in these tanks, whether in the sweltering jungles of the Pacific or the volcanic sands of Iwo Jima, embodied the spirit of innovation and adaptability that defined the American military effort. These tank crews faced enormous challenges, from mechanical breakdowns to fierce enemy resistance, and yet they persevered. The Sherman tank, with all its flaws and limitations, became a symbol of their bravery and resourcefulness. The stories of the tank crews, how they adapted their tactics, used ingenuity to overcome mechanical issues, and supported the infantry during some of the fiercest battles in history, are an integral part of the Sherman's legacy. The tank was not just a machine, it was a reflection of the men who fought inside it. Their ability to adapt to new situations, sometimes even on the fly, helped ensure the Sherman's success in the Pacific theater and its lasting impact on the course of the war. The U.S. military's victory in the Pacific also highlighted the growing role of technology and industrial capacity in warfare. In contrast to the Japanese, whose rigid adherence to traditional combat doctrines and reliance on individual bravery ultimately proved to be their downfall, the Americans demonstrated that a flexible, systematic approach to war, fueled by industrial production and technological adaptation, was the key to success. The Sherman tank was a symbol of that approach, embodying the idea that mass production, versatility, and adaptability were just as important as firepower and armor in the modern battlefield. But the lessons learned from the Sherman tank weren't just applicable to tanks. The U.S. military's success in the Pacific, and the role that tanks like the Sherman played in that victory, reinforced the importance of combined arms warfare. The tank, artillery, air support, and infantry all worked together in a coordinated effort, each complementing the strengths of the others. The Sherman's success proved that modern warfare required cooperation between different branches of the military and a holistic approach to combat. The individual tank was no longer seen as just a piece of armor. It was part of a larger, more complex system of combat that, in the end, the Sherman tank became a defining element of the Allied victory in the Pacific. It was not the most powerful tank of the war, nor the most advanced, but its combination of reliability, versatility, and adaptability ensured its place in history. The Japanese, who had initially mocked the tank as a mere Ronson Lighter, would come to respect it for what it truly was: a force of unparalleled destruction and a symbol of the American military's industrial and technological superiority. By the time the war ended, the Sherman's legacy had been firmly established. It had played a key role in the defeat of the Japanese Empire, helping to break through fortified defenses, support ground troops, and clear the way for the eventual Allied victory. The Sherman tank had proven that, sometimes, victory comes not from the most advanced weapon or the bravest soldier, but from the ability to adapt, innovate, and continually evolve to meet the challenges of war.